Our next speaker is Dr. Aaron Kornblith, he's right here, who is an associate professor of emergency medicine and pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco. He is a physician scientist focused on improving the diagnostic evaluation of sick and injured children through advanced data analytics and clinical trial validation. Dr. Kornblith has received funding from the NIH, NSF, PDC, and the University of California to advance the accuracy and reliability of diagnostic strategies to diagnose bleeding injured children. Thank you, Aaron. And today he'll be speaking on using PCS to improve the care of injured children in the emergency department. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Can you hear me okay? Cool. So as Dr. Tang mentioned, it's hard to show all the cool data and not do it in injustice. And so I'd like to share with you some of the very practical tips we've learned in integrating the PCS framework into some of the healthcare-based projects we've done. And so as Dr. Yu mentioned, this is the creativity in getting some of this work done. So as mentioned, I'm Aaron Kornblith. I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine and pediatrics at UCSF, and I'm really excited to be here. My time with you today is limited, so again, instead of focusing on a project, I'm going to share my thoughts on the role of clinicians and medical AI. So I've received grant funding from the University of California, the NIH, and the NSF, and I'm also a consultant and co-founder of the UCSF spin-out Capture DX. So in this lecture, I'll do my best to give a balanced presentation of my journey as a clinician in AI for healthcare. So injury is the leading cause of morbidity and preventable death in children in the US, and it's been that way for over 30 years. I study how to advance diagnostic strategies to improve the care of injured children, including with the use of handheld ultrasound like what you see here. But injury isn't just my work. It's actually very personal to me. My wife is a trauma surgeon and studies therapeutics for bleeding. I'm an ER doctor and study the evaluation of acute bleeding. And we sort of consider injury our family business and treat it as such. You really can't come to our family dinners if you're squeamish. So similarly, I was injury prone as a child and spent a lot of time in the children's ER in Oakland. So much time that I decided to get a job there. And in 2016, I had taken my first job as an emergency physician at UCSF after completing residency in emergency medicine, fellowship training in pediatric emergency medicine, an additional 2 years of subspecialty training in pediatric emergency ultrasound. So for those of you who are not familiar, in the ER, I use one of these small bedside ultrasound machines to capture images, interpret those images in emergency conditions. For example, in injured children, I look for internal bleeding. Also in 2016, Dr. Jeffrey Hinton recommended that we stop training experts in reading diagnostic imaging, like ultrasound. He predicted that deep learning would replace experts within 5 years, or at most 10. He said, like a coyote looking over a cliff but not knowing the ground is already out from beneath him, Dr. Hinton predicted that 2 years of my training were obsolete. Oh no, I thought. I better get on board. We have made tremendous strides in the world of medical AI. However, there was something missing from Dr. Hinton's prediction. I'm a little nervous to do this. However, I'm going to disagree with Dr. Hinton. And I disagree that we stop training clinicians. And instead, I'm going to double down and recommend that we not only continue training clinicians, but also start training clinicians in how to train AI. So I recently returned home after spring medical conference season, and AI was buzzing. The majority of clinicians believe that AI is something that's going to happen for us, or maybe something that will happen to us, depending on how you look at it. Either way, it was kind of a bad take. And in 2019, I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Yu at the first UC AI in Biomedicine conference. The same AI buzz existed, but at a much smaller scale. Dr. Yu had presented a concept that clinician expertise in medical AI wasn't about the collection of data and the interpretation of results. It was about the entire data lifecycle, including defining the clinical problem, pre-processing, modeling, assigning predictability and stability, interpreting the findings, and then recognizing the next problem. The idea of PCS aligned perfectly with medical AI. But there are barriers to getting clinicians involved in projects. So how do we keep clinicians engaged and part of the process? So our team learned several best practice solutions and engaged clinicians. Dr. Yu and I have recently reevaluated clinical decision rules for injured children using robust and dynamic rule-based models. We've sought ways to augment the interpretation of ultrasound for acutely injured children and develop prediction tools for anticipating high-yield diagnostic tests in the emergency department. These experiences have taught us that teams with clinicians can be very productive, but can also fail if set up incorrectly. So what I'd like to share with you are 2 guiding principles in working with clinicians for medical AI projects. The first is that the team needs to define the clinical problem. This is what the NIH calls the unmet need. This is also in the startup world what's called the product market fit. So here is an example. A common reason to get a chest x-ray is to evaluate children after injury. In this case, this is when I fell off my bicycle. The capital L in the upper left corner signifies the patient's left-hand side. I can see a broken right clavicle or collarbone in this x-ray. In a not particularly well-defined clinical problem, we would ask a model, where is the broken clavicle? After collecting data, labeling images, and modeling, the team has an output, and it gives the coordinates of the injury. The broken clavicle is 500 pixels to the left edge and 600 pixels from the top edge. But let's think about this. What is this model actually doing? What if I told you we care more about the location of the break relative to the clavicle itself? Those closer to the center of the body are more dangerous, and those closer to the shoulder are less worrisome. Unfortunately, we didn't frame the question correctly, so we received the coordinates of the fracture relative to the image edges instead of the clavicle itself. This is an AI project that fell into the clinical problem pitfall. By not having a completely corrected stated problem, the output can't be used in a useful way. So how do we avoid the clinical problem pitfall? We take a field trip to the hospital. We have seen many examples of AI in medicine, which teams develop technically interesting models that are clinically useless. The clinical problem isn't something we get from pondering in the lab. The problem is something that is recognized in the clinical space. A clinical problem is something that fits into a clinical workflow, and ideally an existing clinical workflow. So the team needs to walk through that workflow during their visit. For example, for pediatric injury, we need to see the ambulance arrive, the child wheeled to the trauma bay, the physical exam performed by the physician, and then the gurney rolled to radiology for the x-ray. But the team has to keep in mind that the clinical problem is also something where the current practice can be improved. And improvement can mean multiple different things. But it's usually one or more of the following: faster, cheaper, more accurate, or providing a new capability. As you can imagine, it's difficult for an outsider who hasn't worked in one of these workflows to evaluate all these points. However, if on your field trip you waited 3 hours with me for my x-ray to be read and interpreted by the on-call radiologist, you would see an area for improvement. That's why we want all team members to take a field trip to the clinical environment. So we took our trip to the clinical environment, and we can now visualize the clinical workflow within the clinical problem. So all we have to do now is ask the clinicians to code that problem in the clinical data. Then we take it, we model it, easy. As you know, it's not that easy. Most clinical data doesn't come labeled, and if it does, it's often irrelevant to the clinical problem. More so, getting a group of opinionated clinicians to agree on something like a label or annotation strategy is challenging. Therefore, there's an art in helping clinicians evaluate and label to get the clinical problem. We call this the problem behind the clinical problem. Let me first show you an example of this problem behind the problem, and then give you 2 tips to overcoming it. So first, we need to understand that there's a hierarchy to diagnostic imaging annotations. So for example, in this chest x-ray, the clinician has labeled the image as clavicle broken. In contrast, this annotation strategy uses bounding boxes to highlight the broken clavicle. However, we need an annotation strategy that captures our clinical problem, which is where is the fracture relative to the clavicle? And in this annotation strategy, we use pixel level annotation to show the different fractured segments, orange being close to the middle of the chest, and green having been closer to the shoulder. Of note, these hierarchies are unidirectional. For example, from this more complex annotation task, I can take the work of hierarchy we've obtained and also get bounding boxes or labels, but it doesn't go the other way. And this is super important to recognize because many people want to go ahead and do the most complex annotation task. But why don't we do it? Well, because of time costs. So for example, I know that I can read through 100 x-rays in 1 hour using the clavicle label. However, I can only do 30 x-rays in 1 hour doing the green and orange strategy. So how do we figure out the best labeling or annotation strategy for the clinical problem? Well, the entire team has to try it out. So first, we start to ensure that each strategy has a language, and we write it down on what we call the PCS Rosetta Stone. So for example, the last clavicle fracture strategy is the orange and green strategy, which now puts a name to the task. However, we don't just do this for labels and annotations, we do this for everything. Our team deals with the usual suspects of language stability, including validation versus test. However, we also grapple with medical terminology, such as clavicle versus collarbone, and clinical trials-related issues like study versus examination. So in the setup phase of a project, we occasionally get lost in language. And this is why we keep our PCS Rosetta Stone as a reference tool for all team members to revert back to. So if you learn a new word, you put it on the stone in our team. The second tip is you need to be visual. Every problem behind the problem requires a PCS user manual. We keep these as visual representations on how to perform the task. So I need to emphasize how important it is to create these user manuals. They help with the annotation task. They build consistency among the clinicians. They allow room for feedback and iteration. And it is the document that can be used at the end of the project to help remember how we carried out each task. One of our collaborators and my UCSF mentor, Dr. Atul Butte, says that all the data in the world will not make a difference unless there are people ready to use it. In summary, when considering clinicians and the development of medical AI, first remember to define the clinical problem. This can be done with strategic field trips. Second, address the problem behind the problem by using a Rosetta Stone for language stability and a user manual for helping ensure everyone has met their expectations. A big thank you to these clinical teams that have helped us shape and learn how well the PCS framework adapts to clinical projects, and thank you all for joining today.
We have time for, I think, at least 3 questions.
Okay.
Thanks, really nice talk. I'm interested to hear how this interacts with technology. Presumably, the technology that you need to do that annotation and have that stored is very different than what you need to just write down, clavicle broken. So how has that been a challenging part of getting these workflows going?
Definitely. So the question about how do you actually get through that annotation strategy and what tools do you use to do it? We've used simple tools, Excel spreadsheets and that sort of thing. And we've used more complex tools for image-based things, such as a proprietary tool called MDAI, in which you can actually mark down your annotation strategies. What's important is you have to walk through each of these processes and the entire pipeline. If you don't walk through the pipeline, you don't know what the outputs look like, and you kind of run into problems down the road. And so each student that we've had work within these projects has had to take a step back for just a moment and realize they're involved in the annotation process as much as the clinicians, And that's important only so they know that the formatting of the annotations look like how they want them to look. Great question.
Hello, I just have a quick question. Like, how good are the current open source LLMs in actually reading these clinical images?
How good are they?
Yeah.
The question was, how good are the open source LLMs in reading clinical images?
Yes.
Terrible. So, we've gone both directions where we've tried to have the LLMs read the images, and we've had to actually have them make artificial data for us as well. I have this image I'll show you during one of the break, and we asked ChatGPT to make a brain tumor on a CAT scan, and it did a perfect image of a brain CAT scan and dropped a cartoon-like image of a brain tumor right on top of it. So we've had some issues with the LLMs. I'm excited about where the future could be for some of this work, but as of right now, a lot of it's not ready to go from the visual aspects of things. Thanks for asking.
Those medical images, X-rays, have very strong contrast between background and foreground, and we know AI are particularly good at segmentation of such images. Have you considered have AI jumping first to process pixel level data to a shape level data before human goes in to do annotation?
Great question. So have we thought about using segmentation to look at different types of diagnostic imaging, just to help with the annotation process even? So Ben and I have done that. We're using actually some of this ultrasound data, which is a little more complicated than the X-ray data that I'm showing here. It's quite a bit noisier. However, we're looking at just that idea of shapes. We're borrowing some of the examples we've seen before and trying to pull out some of those shapes. An example would be, I have a good friend that is working on slides for looking at microscope data to pull out different cell types. He borrowed a model that was designed to look at coins and to differentiate between quarters, nickels, and dimes, and instead use that model to look at different size cells. And so again, finding that shape, that roundness, and size. We're doing the same thing with ultrasound data as well. We've had some successes and some non-successes. Great question. Thank you all.
Let's thank our speaker again.